There's plenty of challenging things to deal with as parents. How do we deal with a teenager swearing? You know, we handle a lot of parenting topics here at Live on Purpose TV, dealing with teenagers who can be a little tricky. What do you do about a teenager who's swearing, for example? Let's take that one on with a quick review first of control. This comes back to the 2 rules of plumbing. I've shared these with you before in other videos. What are the 2 rules of plumbing? Well, rule number 1, water runs downhill. Awesome. Good to know as a plumber. Rule number 2, don't lick your fingers. If you've ever replaced a toilet, you know exactly where I'm coming from on this one. Water runs downhill. Don't lick your fingers. That's all you need to know about plumbing. When we're dealing with teenagers, those 2 rules of plumbing are so important, and they translate like this. Some things you control, other things you don't. That's like saying water runs downhill. That should be an obvious thing. Rule number 2, pay attention to the things that you control. Now, that might even turn into a disclaimer, because teenagers swearing, do you control that? No. You don't. If you did, it would happen differently. So obviously you don't control that. How do we deal with that as parents? I've got 3 tips for you. Tip number 1, set a good example. It is so funny that we as parents sometimes get sucked into hypocrisy, right? It's kind of like, no more violence or I'll knock your head off. Do you see the discrepancy there in the message? Our language as a parent matters in terms of our example to our kids. So we show a model of respectful and appropriate language in calm communications, where the tone of voice is conducive toward understanding and empathy. You get where we're going here. Your example matters. Model that as a parent. That's tip number 1. Now here's tip number 2 for how to deal with a teenager who's swearing. Acknowledge who controls what, and then accept and affirm the control that your teenager has. I have parents do this all the time in my office, where we set up a T chart, where you draw a big T, and then on the one side you list all of the things your teenager controls, and on the other side you list all of the things that you as a parent control about their life. And this is kind of a short list over here. The things that are on the teenager's list include how they're going to handle language. That's what we're talking about here today. How they're going to handle dress and appearance. How they're going to handle interactions with their friends. How they're going to handle school. How they're going to handle church. How they're going to handle social interactions. How they're going to handle chores or their level of cooperation in the home. Can you see that all of these things your teenager controls? Now, what do you control about your teenager's life? See, this is where parents come up dry sometimes. There are some important things you control over here, namely what you provide. Now, this is key, because when we get down to what we're going to do about the swearing, you don't control that. That's on this side of the list. However, you control a lot of things on this side of the list that your teenager is concerned about. The services you provide, access to certain things, what you personally will do or won't do, your own language, your own attitude. This is all on your side of the list. And so we get to use these things to hopefully influence these things over here, the things that you don't control. When I said accept and affirm that, one of the best practices that I know in parenting teens is to yield and acknowledge that control to them. In other words, well, this is something that you control, not me. If we're talking about language, that's very true. I'll put it into an example for you here in just a minute. So let's go to tip number 3, which is to set up and enforce appropriate consequences. We're going to do this by drawing on what we talked about in tip number 2 about understanding where the control is, who has the control, accepting and affirming that. Now, as we set up the consequences, we're always going to pick stuff from our own list over here, okay? We don't want to get into a power struggle over here with the kinds of words that our teenager is using. When they're swearing or using profanity, they control that, we don't. So we're going to control something on our list in exchange for their controlling something on their list in a way that we appreciate. So, quick story. I was working with a mom who had 2 very large, husky, athletic teenage sons. These sons were getting into some inappropriate language, and it was really kind of disrespectful and distasteful in a lot of ways. Because mom wanted to deal with her teenager swearing productively and appropriately, we made this part of our consultation. So we had the conversation about who controls what and how you have to set up the consequences, kind of like what I've set up for you here today. So I asked her, I said, how likely is it that they're going to continue with this swearing? Oh, it's so likely. They're doing it every single day. Every time we get in the car, for example, and they just start popping off with all this stuff that's so offensive to me. I said, awesome, which surprised her. But it gives us an opportunity to try something, right? To learn something. So I said, you've got an opportunity today. Are you pretty sure? And she's like, oh yeah, it's going to happen. Great, awesome. Let's set it up in a way that the consequences are something that you can enforce. 100%, you're going to acknowledge and affirm their control. Let's see how it plays out. Okay? And we did a few role plays there in the office. But she had a trip that was, they lived just in the outskirts of the city. And so it was maybe, 2 or 3 miles that they were ranging for this particular road trip. I think they were going to a grocery store or something like that. Anyway, as sure as shooting, and she would have predicted it, they start popping off with their disrespectful language. She makes an initial request for them to change their language and stop swearing. Guys, that language is offensive. Would you please stop? They respond with even more profanity and inappropriate language. Guys, she says again, please stop. That language is offensive. As she's pulling over to the side of the road. Now here's the setup, right? She's pulling over to the side of the road. She gets to the side of the road and she stops the car and she says, this language is not appropriate in my car. Please get out. Okay, now I know what you're thinking. 2 big athletic teenage boys, little petite mom who's telling her to get out of her car. What's going to happen? Well, they're just going to stay put, right? And they did. They just kind of settled down into that back seat and said, we're not getting out. And they're still popping off with their disrespectful attitude. So mom was brilliant. I love the way that she did this. Remember, we got to control what we control, not what we don't. Can she control whether her kids get out of her car? Not really, unfortunately. They're bigger than her. And they outnumber her by a double factor. All right, so what is she going to do? She simply turns off the car right there on the side of the street where she parked it, turns it off, takes the keys with her, and she gets out of the car. I thought this was brilliant. She walks across the street to a store. The boys are just watching like, what's going on, right? But they're just kind of chilling there in the car. She comes back out of the store, steps over to the curb on the other side of the street, and steps into her friend's car who's there to pick her up. She waves at the boys across the street. See, guys, she's smiling. By the way, when mom's smiling, kids are thinking. Just keep that in mind. She hops into her friend's car. They drive off. And the boys are left there alone without a key. What are they going to do? Well, it's a couple of miles from home. Mom goes home And she's already made arrangements. She's going to go pick up the car later, but this lesson for her sons is more important than the fact that her car is now 2 miles away from her house. So she's in there making dinner, right? She's whistling while she works. She's working on her own attitude and mood because she does control that. The boys come in about an hour later, having walked the entire distance to their home. Now, can you picture that these boys are in a whole different state of mind than they were before? Yeah, and Mom's awesome. She's like calm and cool and collected. She says, "Welcome home, boys. Dinner will be ready in just a minute. Make sure you wash up." Now, what's going to happen the next time Mom has an issue with disrespectful language in the car? Do you see how powerful this is? Just one more quick example. Another mom that I was working with, having a problem with her teenager swearing. And we talked through the whole model that I've shared with you here today. And she chose a little different approach. So I love the way that she did this. She approached her son in this case. I think she had a daughter who was getting sucked into it as well. But so her kids, she approached them and said, "Guys, I realize that I don't control you. You do. You're the ones who are controlling your life." This is that accept and affirm step that we talked about. You control your life. What kind of language you use is totally up to you. Now, you know that I don't like the swearing, but I've decided that I will put up with it. I will tolerate it. Let's just call it a tolerance fee, okay? I will tolerate it for $5 a pop. Any questions? Now, I love this tool as a parent. Any questions? And especially if you say it with a little lilt to your voice, raise your eyebrows just a little. Any questions? And what it means is, hey, I've got this. I've thought this thing through. You might want to ask some questions if you're a little unclear about what's going to happen next. But a lot of kids don't have that level of curiosity. They're just like, whatever, and they blow you off. Which her kids kind of did. So they launch into dinner time or whatever it is, and both her son and her daughter start popping off with swearing. She pulls out a little notepad. Okay, she doesn't yell at him. She doesn't engage in that. She simply pulls out a little notepad and she starts taking some notes. Okay, and they're wondering what she's doing, and they asked her, and she said, "Oh, I'm just keeping track. Just go on. Go ahead." Well, that stopped them because suddenly they're like, whoa, this is different. What they're used to is Mom yelling and screaming at them, and then they just swear back at her. No, she's just taking notes. Okay, at the end of the day, there's a little reconciliation. So, William, you swore 4 times. 4 times 20. Oh, sorry, it was only $5. Just kidding. 4 times 5 is 20. You owe me $20. How would you like to cover that? Do you want to pay me in cash, or do you want to go on my easy payment plan? Now, he's not going to want to pay her in cash. That's fine. She's already got him set up on the easy payment plan. What she had done was confiscated something that belonged to William that's worth at least $20. She simply tells him, hey, you pay off your $20, you get your collateral back. You've got till Saturday. All right. Now, that's brilliant. Then she goes to her daughter. Jane, you only swore 3 times. Way to go. Awesome. So you owe me $15. How would you like to cover that? Same thing. She kept her cool. She simply implemented the consequence, acknowledged their control, and she got on top of it. Okay, so there's 2 examples of moms who have used this kind of an approach to handle their teenager swearing. I think you can probably do this too. These parenting challenges are something that we can team up on. Click right over here to connect to the Parenting Power Up. I think you're going to like it.